Good morning. Welcome to Radio Era Environnement. I am Umi Ahmed Mikidash and you're listening to Your Voice, the voice of experts with Fadhel Kaboub. Fadhel Kaboub is a senior advisor of PowerShift Africa, a think tank based in Kenya, providing analyses and solutions from an African perspective. Ahead of the 20th United Conference on Climate Change held in Dubai, he gives his views on the information revealed by the BBC related to the plan of the UAE President Sultan Al Jaber to sign deals on fossil fuels with 20 countries in parallel of the negotiation. Fadhel Kaboub explains his concerns and brings his solution based on the science and analyses on the economic aspect of the situation of the global south. For about 30 minutes, he brings his expertise on how the global south should react to face climate debt. He discusses this concept and its consequences for developed countries and underlines the importance for these countries to pay their debts because of the historical responsibility of greenhouse gas emissions. On the other side, he highlights concrete cases of heavily in-debt southern countries and shed light on solutions that could help these countries. As one of the authors of the Just Transition reports, he raises concerns related to the carbon market and gives his solutions. He also answers questions related to the operationalization of the loss and damage fund and the current problem discussed within the Group 77 plus China related to the place of reception of the fund. He describes what is at stake. He raises the reluctance of developed countries such as the United States of America and the countries of the European Union. Fadhel Kaboub is an associate professor of economics at Nations University in the United States of America. He is on leave. He is currently based in Kenya. He is working on climate finance and development policies in Africa. He is an expert on designing public policy and help countries to enhance monetary and economic sovereignty in the global south. His most recent co-authored publication is Just Transition, a climate, energy and development vision for Africa, in May 2023, published by the independent expert group of Just Transition and Development. You are listening to Your Voice with Fadhel Kaboub. I am Umi Ahmed Mikidash. You are listening to Your Voice with Fadhel Kaboub. I am Umi Ahmed Mikidash. Good morning and welcome to Radio Era Environnement. I am Umi Ahmed Mikidash and you're listening to Your Voice with Fadhel Kaboub. Good morning, Fadhel Kaboub.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on the show.
Fadhel Kaboub, welcome to Your Voice, the voice of experts. You are an associate professor of economics at Nations University in the US and president of the Global Institute for Sustainable Property and member of PowerShift Africa. Ahead of COP28, the UN Climate Change Conference conference held in Dubai this week from November 30th to December 12th, we would like to have your view related to the information revealed by BBC related to the UAE national oil company boss Sultan Al Jaber, who actually plans to discuss fossil fuel deals.
Yes. Well, in a way, this is not surprising at all because the COP meetings have been dominated by the fossil fuel industry. Last year, I think the fossil fuel industry had more delegates at COP than any given country. So if the fossil fuel industry was a country, it would be the most influential country in COP. The other thing to acknowledge is that the fossil fuel industry has been engaging in a systematic campaign of distractions and obstructions and denial, and a PR campaign to just create debate, just to question the concept of climate change, to question the concept of a just transition, just to delay and distract us from focusing on them. And here's why. because the science is very, very clear. And I'll come back to the economics in a little bit. But on the science front, UNEP, the latest production gap report, yet again confirms that we are on track to extract and burn twice as much fossil fuels by 2030 than we're actually allowed to, which means two things need to happen. Number one, we must stop adding additional fossil fuel infrastructure immediately. And what we're doing currently is actually adding new infrastructure at the tune of at least $500 billion a year. A lot of it is happening actually in the global north, the historic polluters. And number two, what the production gap report suggests, what the science suggests, is that we need to negotiate a rapid phase out of fossil fuels via an international treaty, like the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative is suggesting, within a framework of a just transition for workers in the fossil fuel industry, just transition for developing countries that didn't cause climate change and are locked into a fossil fuel energy system, just transition also for developing countries that rely heavily on exports of fossil fuels as a main source of revenue, given that many of them are in a debt trap and they need revenues. So this is the just transition framework that we need to be negotiating. Instead, we're wasting time dealing with this systematic campaign of obstructions and delays and distractions by the fossil fuel industry. So in a way, I'm not surprised to see this happening at this particular COP. And jokingly, I said if we don't address the fossil fuel phase out issue head on in Dubai, then we might as well have the fossil fuel industry host the next COP meeting at their headquarters and be very clear and open about who's running the show.
I see. So tell me, you said related to the economic aspect. You didn't.
Mm-hmm.
You explained the UNEP,
so that's the science
environment.
Yes.
You explained the UN Environment Gap Report 2023, which is the framework that people understand. But how you explain the economic aspect? I mean, in September, there was this climate week held in African Climate Week held in Kenya. And one of the countries which will have, or which should have, according to what the BBC revealed, should have an agreement with the UAE is Kenya. How can you link the economic aspect on this? You said just transition.
Yeah.
Also.
Yes. Yeah. So the on the economics front, thinking about the fossil fuel industry, and then I'll come back to the Africa Climate Week in Kenya and the UAE. On the economic front, when you think of investments in fossil fuel infrastructure, you have to think about the economics of it and the rate of return that investors expect, because investors are putting money up front to build infrastructure, and they expect a rate of return over the lifetime of that physical infrastructure. And the lifetime of physical infrastructure in the fossil fuel industry is between 30 to 50 years minimum. But if we take the science seriously, which says we need to phase out fossil fuels, and if countries that are already decarbonizing successfully continue the decarbonization, the demand for fossil fuels will decline. This was actually the findings in the latest report of the International Energy Agency from just 3 or 4 weeks ago. The report basically says demand for fossil fuel is stalling and it's going to decline in the next 10 years, which means investors who are expecting more extraction and a higher rate of return will live in a world where demand for fossil fuels is declining, which means prices are declining and returns will disappear eventually. So they will end up essentially with what we call stranded assets, both physical stranded assets that are no longer needed and financial stranded assets. So from my perspective, if we take the economics seriously and if we take the science seriously, then what the fossil fuel industry is doing has to be one of two things. They're either signing our collective suicide pact for humanity intentionally, because we know what the science says about climate change, or they're committing financial fraud. They're duping investors, selling them assets that will not generate the expected rate of return and will generate losses for those investors. So either way, whether it's a collective suicide pact or financial fraud, it needs to be treated as a crime and it needs to be treated accordingly.
Treated as a crime. How do you link what you're saying with what the discussions on how to define, and I will also come back to Kenya, where you are basically now. There was this climate, the African Climate Week. A few months before, there was the new financial pact in Paris with Kenya at the forefront, explaining what will be at stake at the Climate Week, African Climate Week. There was announcements during African Climate Week related to the economic aspect. How can you explain? And you said now that the fossil fuel will be declining according to this report from AIE. But how can you understand the policy of Kenya related to what you're saying that is actually an alert related to what the government from the UAE are doing related to this agreement? How do you understand it? How can you explain to the communities? How can you make them understand that there is double standards?
Sure. So one thing we have to understand for a country like Kenya or any other developing country, you have to understand that their issue is not just a climate issue. They're facing an entire dashboard of economic problems. You have a debt problem, you have food security problem, you have national security problem, you have regional security problem. So there's a bunch of pressure points that the global north, the EU in particular, can use to pressure countries to act in a particular way. So we have seen this, for example, with Barbados, which was leading the way on the climate conversation, on the debt conversation, on restructuring the global financial architecture, and that was a breath of fresh air in the global discourse from a global South perspective, and that was immediately hijacked by the global North, and that was the Paris summit. It turned into a Macron summit, how Macron is going to fix the world for the global South on his terms, on European terms. The same thing you can say is happening to Kenya. President Ruto was also a major African voice on the climate front, on the debt front. But Kenya is also a debt-distressed country, right? And Kenya is desperate for financial resources to deal with the debt issue, to deal with the multitude of issues that we're dealing with. So when you're cornered as a developing country and offered very little in terms of financial options, you can be easily coerced or manipulated into accepting the least amount of financial resources as an individual country and breaking away from what could be a global South united front on climate, on debt, on development, on energy issues. And unfortunately, this is what we've seen happening in Kenya. So Kenya is willing to accept financial crumbs in the form of carbon credits, for example. Carbon credits are essentially pollution permits for historic polluters in the global north to greenwash their activity and say, we're buying carbon offsets from Kenya. Well, the flip side of that transaction is that Kenya receives a little bit of cash, which it will use very quickly to pay its debt, to service its debt. And meanwhile, Kenya is losing territorial sovereignty over millions of hectares of land, displacing people from their ancestral land, from their pastoral territory, and in the process, giving millions of dollars in commissions and fees to the middleman, to carbon credit companies like Blue Carbon, this UAE company that's now taking over, millions of acres of African land just in the last few months in Liberia, in Kenya, in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, and beyond. And this is just the beginning. So what we end up doing is pollution permits, displacing people, financial crumbs that go towards debt payment, not actually development, not actually climate action. And we haven't reduced global emissions because the historic polluters keep greenwashing what they're doing. So When you're a country like Kenya or Liberia and you have a massive debt to service and there is nothing available to you in the global financial architecture to restructure your economy, to actually transform your economy, reach your potential, and the only option offered to you is carbon markets or pollution permits, then you just take it and you move on. And that's unfortunately what we see happening with the way the historic polluters continue to reject the concept of a climate debt, because they have exceeded their carbon budget and we in the global south have not. So what is owed is climate reparations, not carbon credits, not loans to invest in sustainability, to create more debt traps for the global south. So that has to be the focus of the conversation at COP28, but that requires our leaders in the global south recognizing what is happening and actually building a united front and not compromising on this front. Instead, we end up with, bilateral agreements that are coercing countries to accept, financial crumbs and not really move us forward on phasing out fossil fuels or on delivering trillions of dollars in loss and damage that is owed to the global south.
Tell me, you are one of the authors of this report on just transition, and it is actually led by Yuba Sokona, a scientist since 1976 is on this field. The question is how you can understand this conversation between all these people who know each other. I mean, you said something related to the Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, who, according to you, was hijacking with the situation in her country. But these people know also that there is a link between climate change and all this aspect, this economic aspect. Restructuring the finance means also including the climate action. You said that carbon market is not the right solution. How can you understand that there are people, there are countries who actually integrate it, and there are NGOs from the north working in Kenya related to carbon market, and they say that it's working? How can you explain to our audience how they can understand this and what can be the solutions to help to define their needs by integrating the solutions?
Sure. So if you look at it from a one-sided perspective, it may look like it's working, because from a one-sided perspective, you see, money trickling from the global north to the global south. And it's called, carbon offsets, and it's called climate finance. But if we live on the same planet, so if emissions keep going up because somebody is still polluting in the global north, we're not addressing climate change. But what we're doing is greenwashing the fact that they continue their emissions and looking at only one side of the equation, which is a little bit of cash coming to a country like Kenya and Liberia. And some of it goes to the national government. Actually, the majority of it goes to the national government. And we're not recognizing that it's going immediately to pay for the external debt. But some of it trickles to local communities. Now, if you're a community on the front lines of climate change and a little bit of cash is delivered to you, of course it's helpful. Of course it looks good. But we're saying we're not delivering enough to actually transform the lives and the livelihoods of those communities. And what that means, it means going to the roots of the problem. And the roots of climate change are CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions in the global north. And in this process, we're allowing that to continue, and we're just delivering band-aid help to communities on the front line. So we have to be radicals in the literal sense of the term. What does it mean to be radical? It means going to the root of the problem. And if I'm not going to the root of the problem, then I'm operating on the surface. And on the surface, every intervention you do on the surface, it's called superficial, which means it perpetuates the status quo. It leads us into more dangerous territory in terms of climate change. So we have to be, radical in that literal sense of the term, and carbon markets are not even close to being radical. That's why we call them a distraction and a false solution. And the words of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the context of the civil rights movement, he once said, "I have no time for the tranquilizing drugs of gradualism and incrementalism." And similarly, we shouldn't be accepting these tranquilizing drugs of gradualism, incrementalism, false solutions.
False solution, you said, with the civil society also emphasized it. What is your solution?
The solution in terms of climate finance. It's, as I said earlier, the rapid phase out of fossil fuels, starting with the historic polluters, the industrialized countries that have the historic responsibility for emissions. They also happen to have the financial resources, the technological capabilities, the fiscal space to engage in the phase out more rapidly than us in the global south. Number two, recognizing the concept of a carbon budget, recognizing the concept of a climate debt. And that means paying climate reparations to countries in the global south so we can all transition and leapfrog into a sustainable, clean energy, clean transportation system. And the opportunity is here in the global south, in Africa in particular. We have all the strategic minerals needed for a high-tech revolution, for a clean cooking revolution, for a clean energy, clean transportation revolution. What I mean by that is that when you can industrialize here in Africa to manufacture and deploy the clean energy infrastructure for use on the continent, not for export, to manufacture and deploy the clean cooking infrastructure to deliver clean cooking technology to the 970 million people on this continent who are inhaling toxic fumes on a daily basis, mostly women and children, to deliver clean electricity to the 600 million people on this continent who have no access to electricity today. So this is an industrialization opportunity to create millions of jobs, to deploy the technology to build the basic pillars of development and prosperity. That requires transfer of technology from the global north as a form of reparation. That requires actual partnership as opposed to abusive neocolonial extraction. That requires financial resources, that is, the reparations in financial terms to build the infrastructure and deploy it. And that will be allowing us to escape the bottom of the global value chain of industrialization, which has been the colonial and post-colonial role that was imposed on Africa, on the global south, by the global north. So this is what we mean by reparations, as in the literal sense of the term, repairing the damage to the economy, to the ecology, to the entire global financial architecture that was established in 1944, when most of Africa was still colonized. So it's a financial architecture, an economic architecture that was not designed by us. It was not designed for us. And it can't be the financial architecture that would deliver justice and equity and sustainability to us today.
One of the central negotiations, during COP28 will be on the operationalization of loss and damage. You said that the new financial pact was not something relevant. It was for the president of France, Macron. How can you today understand that in this restructuration of the finance, there is also the commitment to change the way the World Bank, for instance, IMF are operating? But I've also heard, and I want you to confirm, that the G77 plus China, a meeting a few days ago, mentioned that this operationalization of loss and damage will be held in the head office of the World Bank. The head office of the loss and damage fund, will be in the World Bank head office. How can you understand it? If actually you said that these African countries were not part of the conversation during the World War II, and there was this discussion in Paris on this restructuration of the finance. And today, this loss and damage, which has been actually the solution by the South to help the South. And actually, today it will be held in the North. How can you understand it? And what can be actually the activities that the people and the discussion that the people will talk about during this COP related to this? What do you think of this? Do you think that there is a balance? What do you think of the fact that loss and damage fund will be held at the office of the World Bank?
Well, Humi, this in and of itself is actually a crime for the following reason. Number one, to be very clear, this was not the goal of the G77 or developing countries moving into these conversations about loss and damage. This was imposed by the United States. The US made it very clear that the loss and damage fund has to be based at the World Bank. Otherwise, there will be no loss and damage funding because they want to control the process from the beginning. Let me put things in context. If we're really serious about climate finance and the loss and damage fund, then we need to be thinking in terms of trillions of climate finance, not billions. Let's say we're successful at this COP somehow to guarantee that we're going to kick off the loss and damage fund with $1 trillion, just 1 trillion, which is possible and affordable. Do you know how much the World Bank will charge in fees for hosting the loss and damage fund? The standard hosting fee that the World Bank charges to other funds, including funds for education and funds for health, 24%. That means if we put $1 trillion in the loss and damage fund, the annual fee collected by the World Bank will be $240 billion, just in fees to the World Bank as an institution. Now, there has never been any climate fund in the history of the planet that actually has $240 billion. And the World Bank will, on day one, collect $240 billion. The $100 billion that was promised 15 years ago and not delivered, we didn't even reach. Yeah, exactly. So that's why I refer to this as a crime, that the World Bank is going to be allowed to collect 24% of every dollar put into the loss and damage fund. Those are 24% away from climate action, away from the most vulnerable countries. So for that reason alone, we should not allow the World Bank to host anything moving forward that's related to climate change or health or education or anything like that, because it's obscene to collect this much in fees just for hosting. There are other international financial institutions that can host the loss and damage fund at much, much lower fees, processing fees and so on. There's also a good reason to put the loss and damage fund at the Green Climate Fund, which was established on a more democratic basis, meaning one country, one vote, which is precisely why the US and the Europeans refused to go into the Green Climate Fund, because it's democratic, because it doesn't give them veto power. And so this is a question of power.
This is a question of power, but G77 plus China and the US, how can you understand that China and the US and G77 China cannot have an agreement related to this loss and damage fund? You mentioned Green Climate Fund, but to have access to the Green Climate Fund, even if it's a balance, as you said, it's difficult for countries in the South to have access to this finance. How can you actually link the activities of the Green Climate Fund and the loss and damage fund in the near future, for instance, if you want to raise that question that the Green Climate Fund should be the host institution, loss and damage funds?
It's all in the negotiation of the terms and conditions of how the loss and damage fund will be structured. There's two things that are crucial to define here. Number one, who's going to contribute into the loss and damage fund and under what formula? And this is a point of contention. And number two, it's who's going to benefit from the loss and damage fund and under what conditions. The current status of these negotiations is that the US is not going to accept that a country like China, for example, could potentially become a recipient of loss and damage fund, because based on historic responsibility, China was a developing country, not a big CO2 emitter for a long time. It changed, of course, in the last 20 or 30 years, and China became a major emitter. But that transformation of adding, substantial emissions on the Chinese balance sheet, so to speak, was due to the fact that the global north was outsourcing its dirty industries, its energy-intensive industries, to China to produce consumer goods that are actually consumed in the global north, not in China. So you can argue about who's actually responsible for those emissions when you look at the carbon footprint. So the US is not going to accept that China can potentially be a recipient of loss and damage fund. Instead, the US wants China, as a big polluter today, to contribute to the loss and damage fund.
But how about the Paris Agreement? How do you link the Paris Agreement? The Paris Agreement you emphasize this carbon market, you emphasize the loss and damage funds, you emphasize this actually IPCC 6 assessment report will highlight the need for a phase out of fossil fuels, and also the report of the other institution. How do you link actually the Paris Agreement, like the Article 6, the historical responsibility, and all these aspects on finance? And I have to just understand the $100 billion per year will be discussed at the next COP. So how this climate finance will be integrated if actually the Paris Agreement and the global stock take, which will be this year, won't be implemented, as actually people are saying that there will be barriers? How will you link the Paris Agreement with all the activities you mentioned?
I think the only way to push forward with a clear agenda is to have a global South G77 united front, uncompromising on these issues. On carbon markets and the Paris Agreement, things change. What we know today about how carbon markets actually function make it very clear that this is a false solution. If you don't cap emissions, if you don't limit emissions, you just issue unlimited licenses to pollute, then you don't have a climate finance solution here. If you look at the audit that The Guardian reported on a few months ago, the audit of the top 50 carbon market projects, most of them in Africa, they could not find a single project that would actually qualify as a carbon offset, as a true carbon market solution. All of it was essentially greenwashing projects. So we know this for a fact now, which means moving forward, we cannot count on carbon markets being a climate finance solution for reasons that we discussed. So it is really not going to be easy if the global South is not united with a clear set of demands to push for actual binding solutions moving forward. And that's been always the strategy of the European Union, of the US, is to divide and conquer, even in the climate space, to divide LDCs separately from G77, to divide the vulnerable 20, the SIDS, the small island developing states, and to push them into forming different strategies and different talking points and different demands from the rest of the G77 to break that global alliance. And we saw the success that happened last year when all developing countries formed the united front and said, we will not leave Egypt without a loss and damage fund. There will be no agreement. That's exactly what happened. Loss and damage fund was created in the last minute of the COP last year. So similarly, this year, we have to have a similar kind of unity on demanding a phase out of fossil fuels with a just transition, demanding in an uncompromising way at scale funding of loss and damage on terms and conditions that are favorable to the global south, not just to the poorest countries. This is now the narrative that the US is trying to push, that only vulnerable countries will benefit from the loss and damage, which means the poorest countries, means middle income developing countries, large developing countries will not have access to it. There's also the implied demand from the US that fossil fuel exporters will have to contribute to the loss and damage. That would include a country like Colombia that is in a debt crisis, a country like Nigeria, a country like Ecuador, countries that are deeply indebted, developing countries, not historically responsible for climate change. Now the US is shifting the responsibility on them to contribute to the loss and damage fund.
We are nearly at the end, but back to what actually the BBC revealed. The deal over liquefied natural gas in Mozambique, Canada, China, and Australia against China. There is actually also this unbalanced understanding of what actually China is doing with the US domestically. There is this policy, this national policy in the US with China, which is not actually accepted by the experts in the US. So back to the negotiation, how can you link what is happening related to this battle between China and the US and all these countries together, the G77 plus China, Africa, LDCs, and small island states? How will you link this battle in bilateral agreements and these multilateral negotiations?
Yeah, it's very simple. I mean, China and the US are competitors, clearly adversaries on so many fronts, on the economic front and geopolitical front. But on the climate front, we can't really count China as a climate champion. And the US is certainly not the climate champion or the leader that we need in these conversations. So it's not surprising to see that their interests align in some sense when it comes to climate negotiations on fossil fuels in particular, because China is an energy-hungry country and doesn't see its current economic model continuing at this pace without access to fossil fuels. And instead of having the US bring some leadership in this negotiation and this conversation about phasing out fossil fuels, we see their interests aligning along with the interest of the fossil fuel industry, unfortunately.
Lastly, related to the debt, related to these countries, small island states like Barbados, and what you're saying related to Colombia, Nigeria, what can be the solution to help fighting these debts and help these countries to moving forward?
Well, you start with the debt audit and you figure out what is legitimate and what is illegitimate, what has been paid over many times over. Yeah, and you engage in odious debt cancellations and debt relief in the fullest sense of the term, as opposed to just debt restructuring. So that has to be part of the conversation. The first component of climate reparations is actually debt cancellation. And we know this for a fact because when Germany emerged out of World War II, there are two things that helped Germany become the economic powerhouse that it is today. Number one was the 1953 London Accords, which canceled 50% of Germany's debt. And guess who contributed to Germany's debt cancellation? A country like Malawi, and a country like Pakistan, a country like Sri Lanka, countries that are deep in debt crisis today. And number two, what happened to Germany is the US gifted 5% of its GDP in the form of the Marshall Plan. That's the equivalent of $1.2 trillion in today's money. So that's how you restructure countries. You cancel debt and you invest in industrializing and developing the country on a massive scale, not in terms of financial crumbs and debt traps. So Germany's development was not with loans, it was with grants. And that's what the Global South deserves today.
Thank you very much, Fadhel Kaboub. It was Fadhel Kaboub on Your Voice on Radio Era Environnement. Thank you.
Thank you.